The Hog Rider is one of the most iconic troops in the Clash universe. In Clash Royale, it functions as an offensive fast-tempo card for the cost of just 4 elixir. Given its lower rarity, it's always been a popular choice for a win condition, as confirmed by the fact that it's the most used win condition on ladder today. The interesting thing about Hog Rider is that the last balance change it received was in 2017, making it the second longest time a card has gone without receiving a balance change in Clash Royale history still ongoing, which is particularly interesting considering the Hog Rider troop doesn't appear in any other cards, nor is the card really a mid-ladder menace. And even balanced cards typically need tweaks every so often just to keep up with the changing pace of the meta and new cards being added. Despite not having been changed, its place in the meta has shifted greatly over the years. The Hog Rider has had a huge impact on several Clash Royale metas, and about a year ago, I even made a whole video dedicated to just one of the many iconic decks surrounding this card. But today, I want to go deeper into the Hog Rider's history, so let's go all the way back to 2016 and observe why the Hog Rider hasn't been changed much, the iconic decks it has been a part of, and the impact it's had on the Clash Royale meta for many years. The Hog Rider is as old as the game itself, being available to play since the very first day of beta. Hog Rider is one of the most iconic troops in the Clash universe and a fan favorite, so not including him in the new Clash game would have been a crime. The Hog Rider has a fun personality and design. The iconic scream is so iconic that even people who don't play Clash games are familiar with it. But enough of the background. How good was this card? Instantly, it was actually the most popular win condition, appearing in 41% of top ladder decks. Over the first couple of months, this number would slowly increase to a whopping 56%, becoming the second most used card in Clash Royale. The Hog Rider was commonly seen with the freeze spell early on. The freeze was much bigger and lasted longer, making it very strong and a good support spell to make the Hog Rider indefensible. It was also commonly used with the Prince, who was considered to be a very powerful card during this time as well. There were multiple balance changes during this period, including nerfing the Prince and freeze spell, which didn't really affect the Hog Rider's usage. Despite this, the Hog Rider continued to receive no nerfs. But there are many important factors to consider. Although 56% usage was high even for the time, remember, given the fewer cards in the game, a 56% usage was equivalent to about a 16% usage rate in 2023. There were fewer win conditions, many of which were either bad on their own, or an epic card, making them difficult to level up even for big spenders. This meant the usage rates were not really an accurate representation of the Hog Rider's true strength. Remember, challenges and the tournament standard weren't implemented yet, meaning we don't have anything to look at to more definitively determine this. Supercell also heavily encouraged offensive playstyles over defensive playstyles because it made the meta more fun in their opinion. Defensive cards like Expo were nerfed several times early on because of how often it drew out games, despite its use rate not even being close to as high as Hog Rider's. Hog Rider was kind of like Supercell's golden child during this time. The reason it was so offensive was because it was one of the few cards to not target troops, meaning unless you had a defensive building, he would run right to the Princess Tower. And he also traveled at a whopping speed of 2 tiles per second, one of the fastest speeds in the game. But unlike troops that were faster than the Hog Rider, he didn't need to build up and charge his speed. The second you placed him down, he would go from 0 to 120 tiles per minute instantly. And if all of that wasn't enough, he also had this unique jumping ability which allowed him to be able to cross the river at any point, not just the bridges, which just allowed for so much flexibility when playing him. At the time, no other ground troop was able to do this. The simplicity is also what drew a lot of casual players towards the card. Not only was he a generally good card, but he was simple to play successfully. His major weakness to compensate for his strong attributes was his sight range, clocking in at 10 tiles, easily the most of any troop at the time. Most troops only had a 6-tile sight range. A larger sight range makes a troop easier to distract with defensive buildings. Despite the Hog's popularity being on a non-stop incline, it would receive a buff at the end of February. This change was more so to indirectly nerf defensive buildings. Every troop's sight range was decreased in this patch. The Hog Rider's sight range was decreased from 10 tiles to 9.5 tiles. Defensive buildings were prominent in Clash Royale up to this point, but they were pretty much the Hog Rider's only weakness, so specifically buffing the Hog Rider against them seemed counterproductive. And yes, it was a standard change, but they could have just excluded the Hog Rider. Despite this buff, however, the Hog Rider's popularity would begin to decline around this time. 6 new cards were added at the same time as this buff, which really shook up the meta. The Royal Giant specifically was an interesting addition in this case because it was a common rarity win condition that was pretty simple to play, giving some competition to the Hog Rider, who has been a free-to-play player's choice for a win condition since the game's inception. The Royal Giant was pretty awful at first, but after a couple of buffs, he was a staunch competitor. But it wasn't as much of a competition as you would think, since the 2 cards were commonly used together for a while during the Royal Giant's reign. It didn't seem like the cards had a synergy as much as they were just easy to play and easy to level up win conditions. This period is when you started to see the rise of Hog Cycle. Hog Rider decks were the first major iteration of cycle decks you would see in Clash Royale. These kinds of decks focused on cycling to your Hog Rider as fast as possible and overwhelming your opponent with Hog Riders so that they could never build up a proper push. The Hog Rider cycle playstyle rose in popularity and continued to evolve until around May of 2016, where one of the most iconic Hog Rider decks ever would rise above all others. This deck would later be known as Hog Trifecta. The 3 cards that make up this trifecta include the Hog Rider, of course, along with Musketeer and Valkyrie. All 3 of these troops had amazing synergy. If you put a Valkyrie in front of the Hog Rider would push the Valkyrie and the Valkyrie would clear the path for the Hog Rider. This was beneficial because one major weakness to the Valkyrie was that she was slow, so the Hog Rider making her faster made that weakness irrelevant. But of course, these 3 cards weren't the only important cards in this deck. Back in these days, skeletons were the only 1 elixir card, and the elixir pump was 5 elixir, and these were a must-have in cycle decks to keep the decks moving. The elixir pump was a huge player in this deck as well. At this time, it was generally a very strong card, as there wasn't really a way to deal with the pumps efficiently given its cheaper cost and higher hit points, meaning the elixir was more guaranteed back then, which this deck relied on. This deck had very little defense because it focused on offense primarily. It was basically the pinnacle of everything Supercell wanted from a deck at the time. They had been balancing and shaping the meta so that inevitably a deck like this was going to be very popular. However, the community was starting to get really fed up with the Hog Rider. A lot of people were complaining that the Hog Rider was too common and they were sick of seeing it. It was considered to be a very low skill card because there wasn't really a wrong way to play it. You didn't need proper support or good timing or anything. You just placed him at the bridge and he would almost always get value. Even with more competition, the Hog was still being seen in 44% of top ladder decks in May, the most of any troop in the game besides skeletons. The pressure was coming on now, and despite the Hog Rider being a generally healthy card for the game, it was clear that it was time for a nerf. On June 21st, 2016, Supercell would finally give this popular card a nerf, but given the high number of players who had been investing resources into him and relied on him, they didn't want to go too overboard, so all it received was a slight damage reduction of 6%. Certainly not enough to kill the card's popularity. In fact, even after this nerf, Trifecta was the #1 most popular deck in top ladder, being used more than twice as frequently as the 2nd most popular deck. This didn't last long though, because Poison was becoming way more popular, which might sound good for Trifecta since the most popular variation had Poison in it, but it was clear that Poison was working better with cards like Giant, Minor Poison, or 3 Musketeers. It's not like Hog Rider was bad, but other decks just synergized with Poison a lot better and it was very controlling around this time. Thus, the Hog Rider took a massive fall in usage in this period. But regardless, you would continue to see Trifecta, Hog Freeze, and even a weird Hog Bowler deck in top ladder. In the following months, Poison and the Elixir Collector would get some massive nerfs, which pretty much made Trifecta irrelevant, since you really needed to rely on that extra elixir the pump was giving you. But the Hog Rider itself wasn't going anywhere. Hog Freeze was still a popular combo with multiple variants being used in top ladder, but after Trifecta died, you saw the rise of similar Hog Cycle variants including the Log, Princess, and Ice Spirit replacing irrelevant cards. The Ice Spirit was Clash Royale's 2nd 1 elixir card, giving cycle players a new viable option for their decks. Hog Cycle was easily able to adapt into new variants which not only kept the Hog Rider alive, but kept it as the most popular win condition. And that wasn't the end of good fortune for the Hog Rider. Also in October, we saw the release of the Ice Golem, a 2 elixir mini tank that did not get distracted by other troops. Almost instantly, you were seeing the Ice Golem replace the Valkyrie in Hog Rider decks. This was a pretty major shift because the Valkyrie up to this point had been a pretty solid staple with him, but the fact that the Ice Golem was only 2 elixir made it easier to fit into cycle decks, and the fact that it didn't target troops meant it was harder to separate the two units when placed together. For a while, these guys were inseparable. Within a few months, they were basically a staple combo. The Ice Golem secured that a Hog Rider deck would consistently be in the top 3 decks for the rest of 2016, and you would see slight variations depending on what the meta was. You continued to see cycle decks, freeze decks, and by December, Elite Barbarian decks. Elite Barbarians were an interesting pairing because they were equally as fast as Hog Rider and also didn't need to charge up. They were very strong during this period and were seen in a lot of decks, but the most popular one was a Hog Rider deck. And trust me, in mid-ladder, it was so much worse. Another December balance change that affected the Hog Rider's future was the Tornado buff. The Tornado was very unique in the sense that it could pull the Hog Rider off of a player's Princess Tower onto the King Tower, activating it. Activating a King Tower meant that 2 cannons would shoot the Hog instead of 1. Then you could use the Tornado to pull the Hog into the center and have all 3 towers targeted. Before the Tornado's addition, force activating your own King Tower wasn't really possible. When the Tornado's duration was 2.5 seconds or longer, this could actually fully counter it. A King Tower activation wasn't the end of the world for Hog users, but it was a card that Hog players were going to have to keep in mind. There's also one more important variation that I have to cover before we get through 2016. This Hog cycle deck was created towards the end of 2016, but wouldn't gain much traction until 2017. And this deck wasn't just another throwaway Hog cycle deck that would be forgotten in a couple of months. This was considered to be the successor to Hog Trifecta. This was Hog Trifecta 2.0. Hog Trifecta 2.0 was based on the original Trifecta, but like it's already been for several months now, Valkyrie was replaced with the Ice Golem. Also, both 1 elixir cards were included in this deck for maximum cyclability. This was something you didn't really see up to this point. This was another revolution pioneered by Trifecta 2.0. The elixir pump was much worse than it was during the Trifecta's peak, so it wasn't as reliable as it used to be. This led to the deck's average elixir cost to be the lowest of any major meta deck up to this point, 2.6. Players at the time couldn't believe how this deck could even work. Your main defenses were a measly cannon and a musketeer, which could easily be eliminated with something even as basic as a lightning spell. Players were awestruck when they saw this deck in action, how such cheap cards were able to function together so perfectly in order to counter the biggest pushes. By utilizing each of these cards to their fullest potential, they could defend against just about anything. This deck was considered to be way more difficult to play than the original Trifecta, and only the players who were really dedicated to Hog Cycle and took the time to master the deck could make it work successfully. And there were a significant number of top players who found this deck so appealing to the point where it began beating out the Hog Elite Barbarian decks even during the Elite Barbarian's peak. During this time, however, there was not only one variation of Hog Trifecta 2.0 that was dominating the game. Some players did not think the Musketeer was enough anti-air, causing some to replace her with a Mega Minion or the Skeletons with Minions. Neither of those variations lasted very long, however. But there was one change coming that was about to change the course of Hog Cycle decks forever. On January 23rd, 2017, the Zap spell's damage was nerfed so that it would no longer be enough to kill goblins. This meant it was not reliable support for the Hog Rider anymore because if your opponent had goblins, they would have a huge advantage over you now. And if Zap was all you had against a Goblin Barrel, then it would get consistent chip damage on you now. Ultimately, this forced Trifecta 2.0 players to switch their Zap for the Log, and this is the variation that would go on to later be known as Hog 2.6. Although because the Zap, previously the most popular card in the game, could no longer take out a Goblin Barrel, this nerf prompted a tidal wave of Goblin Barrel usage, so you were more often seeing Hog Rider appear in spell bait decks with the Goblin Barrel rather than Hog 2.6. And as the meta developed further, Hog 2.6 phased practically into irrelevance as new Hog Rider decks took the spotlight. You started to see more Hog Giant combos as well as Hog Rider with the Rocket, which was a very powerful spell through 2017. There was a popular strategy typically used in bait decks where the Rocket user would cycle rockets and overly defend instead of getting connections on the tower with troops. It was a frustrating strategy for sure because it was impossible to counter the Rocket. This is also around the time you were starting to see a lot less Ice Golem with the Hog Rider, partially because without the Zap, it wasn't as useful. There were strategies that required both the Ice Golem and Zap. For example, when you have your Hog Golem push defended by minions, the Frost Nova combined with the Zap could completely take them out. These kinds of moves just weren't possible without the Zap, and thus Ice Golem wasn't needed as often. Besides, with the rocket being so popular, most people would just take the equal elixir trade, rocketing the two units whenever they were used together. By April, Hog Rider was in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th most popular decks. This new Night Tornado variant came out, and it was actually considered to be Hog Trifecta 3.0. Hog Freeze, Hog Spellbait, and Hog Cycle were all doing really well around this time. The top ladder usage rate was hovering around 30%, higher than it's been for a while thanks to these new developments. The Hog Rider was so versatile. You could use him in several different decks while still having great success. By June, a new Hog Executioner deck with the Tornado and Rocket rose to prominence. This deck would go on to be the Executioner's most iconic deck and is still a deck many players use today. But more importantly was another viable deck with the Hog Rider. There were just so many developments to the Hog Rider in the first half of 2017. Players were starting to get sick again of seeing him so much. Even though the card promoted healthy gameplay, it was clearly more powerful than it should have been. By October, you were beginning to see P.E.K.K.A, Mega Knight, and even Mortar decks with the Hog Rider. It was involved with so many archetypes, including its own, and by this point it had been over a year since its last nerf, and it wasn't getting any weaker. He consistently remained as the most popular win condition since the game's inception, with slight dips granted, but that was still pretty insane to think about. A lot of the outrage seems to stem from unfairness. How come some overpowered cards like Nightwish got nerfed multiple times very quickly when it was too strong, but cards like Hog Rider, who had similar rates to the Nightwish at her peak, Supercell turned a blind eye to? It was obvious something had to be done, and it wouldn't be long after this before Supercell took action. On December 12, 2017, the Hog Rider would get the last balance change it's ever received. It's crazy that I'm saying that this early in the video, but the Hog Rider just hasn't needed one that badly since this change. It really was the perfect change, since it was able to put the Hog Rider in a balanced state for years to come. Supercell was giving the card another nerf, but it would be slightly more harsh than last time. It would receive a hit speed increase of 0.1 second, and a first hit attack speed increase of 0.1 second. To a casual player, this might sound like nothing, but it did make a noticeable difference. Now, just because this is the last balance change doesn't mean this is where the Hog Rider's story ends. There's obviously something to explain if a card doesn't need a buff or a nerf for several years. And this is not like the Wizards case where they just left it out to rot. The Hog Rider has been a viable card since this last change. It certainly had ups and downs, but overall nobody in the right mind would call the Hog Rider a useless card. Longtime balanced cards like the Miner and Ice Golem, for example, have needed changes just because the meta shifted so much to the point that they were in a different spot than they were when their last changes were made. And the Tesla was a card that got a nerf for being good in 2021, but in 2023 they reverted the change and the card still has suboptimal rates, when back in 2021, this card in the exact same state was way too good. The reason the card in that state worked so well in 2021 but not 2023 is purely because of environment. In late 2021, things like Lava Hound and Archer Queen were meta, which the Tesla worked pretty well against, but in 2023 we've seen a lot more Goblin Giant and Evolved Knight, which Tesla is terrible against. I'm only using Tesla because it's an obvious example. Most balanced cards have a similar experience to this, but in most cases, Supercell doesn't just revert the changes that they made. It's understandable to not change a card if maybe there's a troop that's part of the card that's present in other cards, and changing one card could result in messing up others. This is why the Skeleton troop never gets changes, but the Hog Rider troop is not present in any other card. It's a very unique situation. Shortly after this nerf, the Hog's usage rate fell to about 10 to 15% in top ladder, which signifies the card was balanced. Hog with Executioner and Hog with Mortar were still being used, but the other variants were not quite as popular anymore. The Royal Ghost was extremely popular around this time, so it did make its way into a new Hog deck for the December season. The Hog Rider was humbled a bit for sure, but it was still far from dead. Even after the Royal Ghost was inevitably nerfed and stopped being used in Hog Rider, a similar deck, keeping the guards and Inferno Dragon, emerged from the ashes. But this didn't remain as the most popular Hog deck for long, as Hog with Mortar was on the rise, and by March would not only be the most popular Hog variant, but the second highest used deck in top ladder. The Mortar was pretty reliant on the Hog Rider during this time, but the synergy made it very threatening. This was also around the time where Hog 2.6 was starting to make a comeback. You saw multiple Hog 2.6 users make it to the top 200 in March. This was a response to the rising beatdown meta. Keeping the pressure high and defending with cheap cards was a strategy to help keep beatdown decks in check. For the rest of 2018, Hog 2.6 and Hog Mortar remained popular, and with the Three Musketeers rise, Hog Rider found a spot with them as well. For some time, this Three Musketeer Hog Rider deck was the most popular deck in Clash Royale. And later in the year, Hog Freeze made a minor comeback as well. Hog Freeze was really just a combo that popped in the meta from time to time to say hi and then dipped. It was never really consistent, unlike Hog 2.6, which was solidifying itself as one of the most iconic decks in Clash Royale, succeeding even with major changes to the meta, proving itself to be a force not to be taken lightly. Very few decks last in the meta for more than a year, so this was quite telling of the deck's versatility. For a lot of 2018, the Hog was easily considered one of the, if not the best win condition. Even with the nerfs, he was a beast. But surprisingly, you wouldn't get that notion from looking at his Grand Challenge stats, as this one stat from December 2018 shows his win rate was 36% in Grand Challenges, easily making it one of the lowest winning cards in the game. Even with average or moderately high usage rates, the Hog Rider was holding a win rate in the 30s to low 40s by the end of 2018. A card with a win rate this low typically doesn't have good use rates, so this was another rare situation. But it makes sense because the Hog Rider was one of the funnest, most appealing cards to play in Clash Royale. He was an interesting card, and with the recent nerfs, he took a bit more thought and caution to succeed with. Despite this, some people still think he needed a nerf, but with win rates as low as they were, it just wouldn't have made sense. His staunch popularity on ladder did dip a bit after the nerfs, but he was still being used a lot in that area of the game. 2019 didn't have many major developments to the Hog Rider, and his position in the meta stayed about the same. It wasn't quite as popular as it was in 2018, but still far from dead. Hog 2.6 remained as the dominant variant to nobody's surprise. The only thing I think is worth noting this year is the release of Earthquake. As I've already discussed, the Hog's main weakness was defensive buildings, and the Earthquake's main function was to eliminate defensive buildings, so their bonding was inevitable. Earthquake wasn't super prominent in the meta at this point in time, but still had its niche. Time would go on to solidify the Hog and Earthquake's relationship for several years to come. Later in 2019, we also saw an Executioner rework that made it pretty overpowered, so naturally you saw a lot more Hog X NATO. But it didn't cause a huge uptake in Hog Rider usage, and the Executioner was eventually reverted to a weak state, to where Hog X NATO would be almost unseen until future Executioner buffs. 2020 saw the release of the Firecracker, which was instantly popping up in Hog cycle decks. Earthquake also started to gain more traction in early 2020 and stayed exceptionally strong until about June. During this period, you saw a lot more Hog Earthquake, often paired with either Firecracker or even Royal Delivery. Both cards released in 2020. Bomb Tower was also really popular during this time, so you'd occasionally see it paired with the Hog as well. A lot of the cards released around this time were providing massive developments for the Hog Rider's archetype, which helped breathe a lot more life into this dwindling card. I think it would be a stretch to say that the Hog Rider was dying before these cards were added, but without these new cards being released, the Hog really would have only been seen in Hog 2.6. Despite the new variations popping up, however, Hog 2.6 remained as the most popular Hog variation, often being the #1 popular deck in the game. A big part of 2.6's popularity in 2020 was due to the insane strength of the Musketeer. The Musketeer for a while had been a fairly niche card, often not appearing outside of 2.6. But after a buff in 2019, it had been steadily rising throughout the year, making the most popular Musketeer deck even more popular. The next couple of years were more so the same situation. Hog Earthquake and Hog 2.6 were the main decks you'd see. This Hog Earthquake deck with the Valkyrie was consistently popular all throughout 2021. Once Champions came out, you did see the Archer Queen played with the Hog a bit, but granted, the Archer Queen wasn't just about everything when it was first released. Towards the end of 2021 through 2022, you saw a lot more Tesla with the Hog because it was just an overall better building, and you continued to see a lot of Valkyrie with Hog Rider, partly due to it being a great counter to the Skeleton King meta. Later down in the year though, you started to see the Hog appear alongside alongside the new Mighty Miner quite often. This duo worked surprisingly well for just about as long as the Mighty Miner has been viable. In December 2022, he was overpowered, which made it the most popular Hog synergizer. Late 2022 is also when this infamous Hog X Nano deck made a comeback thanks to Executioner and Goblin buffs. His popularity was rising to become the highest it's been in years. With so many newer cards to support the Hog effectively, Hog 2.6 was finally getting some real competition and was a lot less popular in 2022 than it was in previous years. I think without Earthquake, Firecracker, or Mighty Miner, Hog would have almost entirely slipped out of the meta by now. Its win rate had remained around the high 30s, low 40s, and its use rate for years by now had always been around the 6 to 12% range, which is around what a typical card should be. But thanks to these Mighty Miner decks, it was consistently hovering around the higher echelon of that range. But soon enough, the Hog was about to break that range, thanks to one major new addition coming very soon. In June 2023, evolutions were coming to Clash Royale, giving cards extra buffs and abilities. One of those cards was the Firecracker, a card some Hog decks were still utilizing. So inevitably, some players were going to use this new evolved troop in Hog Rider decks. But that wasn't the end of it, because Supercell had a lapse in judgment as to how good this new troop actually was. The evolution for Firecracker made the troop one of the strongest to ever step foot into the arena. She dealt way more damage than she used to while covering a larger area and being less fragile. So obviously a lot of players were going to utilize this while they could. And the most popular decks she appeared in were Hog Rider decks. The Firecracker without the evolution also got a buff recently before this, so the Hog Rider's use rate as a result of this soared to 20% in Grand Challenges, where the evolved Firecracker wasn't even available. In Ultimate Champion, where the evolved Firecracker was available, it was still around 20%. This new era of Firecracker really helped to bring back the Hog Rider as being the best win condition in competitive play. Although players at the time considered the Firecracker to be a win condition because of how good she was. The Hog Rider may not have been the star of the show, but he certainly played an important role in escorting this pink-haired menace to the top. Unfortunately for the Hog Rider, this popularity would not last. Mighty Miner and evolved Firecracker got major nerfs in the following months, making them less popular, and as a result, Hog Rider less popular. Until eventually, it was right back where it had been for several years already. Not bad, but far from his glory. Today, you'll still sometimes see the Hog being used with Mighty Miner, Evolved Firecracker, and Executioner, but even those decks are past their prime. Also, I cannot believe going into 2024, people are still playing Hog 2.6. But nowadays, it's not uncommon to see Hog 2.6 players utilize the Skeleton's evolution. As more evolutions are released, it'll be interesting to see which ones Hog 2.6 players decide to utilize. The Hog Rider isn't just another card, he's a Clash icon, and he's had other iconic moments in the game's history that I didn't even mention. Like back in 2017, when the new Touchdown mode was released, the Hog Rider was the star of the show. He was so overpowered in Touchdown that they had to ban him entirely from it. If you don't know why, it's because Touchdown is very different from the normal match setup. The goal of this game mode is to get your troops to the end of the field, into your opponent's end zone. Since the Hog Rider was not only the fastest troop in the game who didn't even need to build up a charge, but also ignored all troops, it's obvious to anybody why he would be a first draft pick. Another cool fact about the Hog Rider is that it's the only card to get 2 supercard variants. In 2022, we got the Santa Hog Rider, which dropped presents that, if collided with, summoned spells into the arena. And Terry, the Mega Knight trapped in the body of a Hog Rider. I will say, as much as I seem to be praising this card for how balanced it is, there are people that are upset with the way the card is even today, and I can understand this to an extent. The Hog can be quite difficult to deal with if you don't know what you're doing, and even though the use rate is hovering around 9% in Grand Challenges today, it's in nearly a quarter of ladder decks. This actually puts it in a similar position as the Mega Knight, and you could argue that the Hog Rider is a mid-ladder menace because of this. I wouldn't consider myself to be a mid-ladder player, but I assume the reason it's not complained about as much as the Mega Knight is because the Mega Knight does well against it. As for the future of this card, I firmly believe it does not need any changes. Even 6 years without a change, I still think it's one of the most balanced cards in Clash Royale. Even if it's a little overused on ladder, the Hog is fun to play, it's not boring to play against, most of the time, and it does take skill to play well in competitive play, which should be respected. Thank you all so much for listening, and take care.